Hello and welcome to. Oh, somebody's teleporting. Oh, that's okay. You all can teleport. Okay, anyway, um, I'm standing in front of one of the dungeons. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more deep dive about. Because I did talk about the War of the Magi. Now, this is one of the few remaining remnants that. Remaining remnants. This is one of the remnants of one of the major civilizations of the War of the Magi. It is called Amdapor. Now, Amdapor was a nation of white mages, like I had talked before in the well, or white aspected followers. More is more apt, honestly. They weren't all white mages that we can tell, and Amdapor was this massive. As far as we can tell, there was the Great Keep of Amdapor, and then the lost city of Amdapor, which the ruins that we do actually end up exploring. Both of them are dungeons. Both of them have different versions of them, and they have different stories that all do ultimately tie into the Shadow of Mach raid, which is a big deal because again, all of that has to do with the history of the War of the Magi and the overarching plot between good and evil, you could say, I guess. But you know, stasis and energy and all sorts of other themes, which again is a theme that tends to go through a lot of Final Fantasy storytelling. Now, Amdapor Keep was the bastion that was used, especially during the War of the Magi, close to the end, when Mach did ultimately do its invasion. The reason we know that it was believed that this is one of the last strongholds of the Amdapor people is because even when you talk in the actual dungeon, there's indications that this was one of the few places where the ghosts of the Amdapor people still stayed. There's lots of remnants hovering around the axis of the lost city. There's lots of souls, etc. There's lots of deep void death mouse. There's lots of taints of the void. Still from that battle that lasted ages ago now. And you can still feel the presence of the shadow and the void, which the void is not the same as some other aspects. The void is believed to be a separate dimension that can be communicated by people who do worship the void, which we do know that Mach did. The city of Mach was energy or umbral aspected, and they tended to worship darkness or more dark aspected nature of things. They tended to commune with the void. They tended to enslave void sent for their will or for the will. So it would make sense that there would be void sent of all sorts hovering around Amdapor Keep and the stronghold of their enemies. Now, when you start the dungeon, you're fighting a sect that is a group of crazy worshippers that arose from the latest calamity, the seventh calamity. It's just called the calamity because it's the most recent. But it is the calamity that was caused when the great red moon, Dalamud, fell from the sky in the meteor episode, etc., etc. That is the lore of A Realm Reborn before it was rebooted. And there are worshippers of Dalamud that believe that it is the Dark Aeon and so forth, and they tend to worship a lot of Void Sent. So you'll have Dalamud worshippers. They tend to show up in a lot of places. They tend to show up in Tamtara. You end up fighting a lot of them in Tamtara. You end up fighting a lot of them in Amdapor Keep. You fight some remnants of them, I guess, in the lost city of Amdapor. There's a few other dungeons, but where there's a lot of void scent, you're probably gonna find servants of Dalmud. Now, of course, they're not the same as the Ascian. They sometimes do work with the Ascians, but they're not the same. They kind of do their own thing. The Ascians let them do their thing because ultimately it serves their ends. But as far as we know, but again, they're a totally different. They're a religious order. The Ascians are after things that are from a very different perspective, and so on and so forth. So, when you're fighting your way through, you end up fighting some crazed priests of Dalmud who do invoke some of the void scent that had been slumbering within the walls of Amdapor and Amdapor Keep, including, most notably, if you know anything about Final Fantasy lore, you're going to recognize one of the bosses is the Demon Wall. Now, the Demon Wall has different manifestations throughout the history of Final Fantasy. In Final Fantasy XII, it was a wall that was literally constructed in Wraithball's image to design. It's a magic wall of some sort. Now, in Final Fantasy XIV, it is literally a void scent that has possessed a wall. That's literally what it is. It is. There's nothing else about it. It's just literally a gigantic demon void scent that's intelligent that possessed the wall. And so on and so forth. Now, some of these were defenses that were put in place by the Machians when the Machians did ultimately breach through the defenses of Amdapor and ultimately marched upon the city of Amdapor and destroyed it, leaving behind their sentinels that were locked away ultimately and defeated by the Amdaporian mages at a great cost that we can tell. As you're fighting through, you fight Vodariga, which are basically the Void's versions of dragons. There's other versions of dragons that, of course, are mimicries and mockeries, like Ahriman are mockeries of some things, and there's a hierarchy that we don't really know. We don't really know a whole lot about Void Scent, other than they exist on this other plane, and they can be communed and they can be worshipped, and they can be controlled to a certain extent, as we determined in the Raid series. However, that control is tenuous at best. And so you're marching through, and you fight the Demon Wall, you fight some other very historic creatures within the history of Final Fantasy, and of course with the Final Fantasy XIV flair. And then, depending on which version of Amdapor you're fighting, Amdapor Keep or Amdapor Keep Hard, you're fighting other Void Scent. Like, for example, in Amdapor Keep Hard, you end up fighting the Boogeyman, which is a very powerful Void Scent that has a whole bunch of extra mechanics that can disappear and reappear and summons a whole bunch of sacrifices and so on and so forth. And then, once you get to the very end of Amdapor Keep Hard, you fight a familiar foe, which if you have done the raid roulette, if you've done any of this Shadow of Mog, you're going to recognize it. It is Ferdian. Now, there's not a lot that's known about him. There's some conjecture about who he was. He was a jester. That much we know from his attacks. We know he had something to do with Void Scent. Most probably he was because we see versions of him and copies of him in Mach, and we see a version of him that lives on in Amdapor Keep, it's believed that he was a very powerful void set, or at least he became a void set. See, when versions of creatures become void sent, they become what are known as hollows. So when you're fighting like a hollow version of something like that, you're fighting a void sent version of something. So Verdian maybe was a real person. The Verdian that we fight in Amdapor Keep Hard probably was a real person. May have been also a void sent. The fact that they had existed as long as they had, well, over 1,000 years, well past the beginning of the Dragonsong War and all this other stuff that had happened. Verdian, we know, again, is a void sent because we do see a hollow version of him in the Shadow of Mach raid, specifically the second raid of that series. We do end up fighting him another time in Dunscaith as well, which is the ultimate part of the Machian raid, and it is deep within the Ephemi nation, what was once known as the nation of Ephemi, or Mach, as it's lovingly named after the city. And just like Amdapor. Amdapor, we don't really know if it was the nation of Amdapor, or if it was just the city was Amdapor, and that's the only thing that we have left. But we can assume it probably was Amdapor as the nation, and Euphemi was the nation that opposed them in the Magi War. Femi was the nation of Mach. And so on and so forth. So Ferdian is a jester, and was believed to have been he was instrumental in the invasion forces of Mach marching in on Amdapor. As far as, and it's he probably was just a jester in much of the same way that Kefka was. In fact, actually, from the bits and pieces that we know, which there isn't a whole lot of an origin story to him, he's very shrouded in mystery and obfuscation and everything. We do know that within the Machian society, he came from very humble origins, and all of a sudden, it started becoming more and more powerful, became this jester of very well renowned, and had some connection with the powerful army of Mach. Again, exactly how much that was, if it was anything like Kefka from Final Fantasy VI, where he used mind control, there's a lot that we don't know. You can conjecture that maybe he used mind control, maybe he didn't, maybe he used void scent that possessed people. Again, we know that he had connection to the void because of how we fight him, when you fight him at the end of Amdapor Keep, how he laughs and you don't actually defeat him. You don't actually kill him properly. So again, he probably makes a reassurance back in Mach and is completely consumed as a void scent. But again, that's pure speculation at that point. It's likely that he had been possessed and consumed long before, and his copy that we fight in the Mach raid is indeed that. He is a void scent copy, nothing more, nothing less. Probably was a notable general, much the way that Kefka was a notable general in Final Fantasy VI. Again, and again, I'm working on very bits and pieces and surviving lore and records and stuff, which aren't very many, because there's just not a whole lot that survived of that period of time, other than what we experience in game and a few scant pieces of text and other conjectures and stuff. But we do know that Amdapor Keep has a lot of remaining creatures that are not of Amdapor, which you know because you only see essentially Void Scent and fungi and stuff. You don't see any of the uh, you don't see any of the white mages, not even possessed versions of them, which is kind of strange. But you do see possessed black mages in the context of the mock raid, which is kind of interesting. Now, of course, there's other conjectures based on Shadowbringers. There's creatures that look very similar to creatures from the Shadowbringers expansion, which there is actually a very important reason for that, and lots of lore about why that is, why there is that connection to begin with. Sorry, somebody was switching to a job right around me. So sorry about that extra noise. Would you stop, person? Thank you. Anyway, um, so yeah, that was pretty much. I can't honestly think of anything else because again, this was going to be a little bit longer, but we are working with piecemeal parts of the storyline. We do know, honestly, we know more about the actual war than we know about the individual ruins. And so again, this is a little bit shorter video, a little bit shorter lore pieces, and so on and so forth. But I hope that this helps illuminate a little bit of the story. And if you have any questions or anything else, and any suggestions or so on, I would appreciate them about what else you want to learn in game, etc., etc. And until the next one, I will see you later. Bye bye.